The following interview is a presentation of Ofiɔ Media. It first aired on KXLU Los Angeles. My guest today is the Director of Jazz Studies at Cal State Northridge and a former associate professor at Los Angeles City College. As a drummer, she's made herself an essential part of the Los Angeles jazz scene, leading groups of her own and playing alongside a lot of other great musicians, including legends like Bobby Bradford. And if I can editorialize just a little bit, she's a drummer with a really impressive touch on the instrument and a really wonderful sense of improvisation. So Tina Raymond, thank you so much for making yourself available today.
Of course, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for that intro too. That was lovely.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Well, I want to start by asking you just a really simple question, or maybe it's kind of a two-parter. How did you come about percussion or come about the drum kit? And what are your earliest kind of musical memories?
Yeah. So I grew up in Metro Detroit, and my parents had my sister and I in all sorts of activities as a kid. And I grew up taking dance lessons, very classical Russian method ballet, very strict. And then in fifth grade, you were able to pick your instruments. And I had braces at the time, and my sister, who's 2 years older, was trying to help me figure out what I could play. And it's like, I want to play trumpet. No, you can't play trumpet. That's going to be really painful. I want to play French horn. No, you shouldn't do that. Well, I want to play flute like you. No, you should pick your own thing. You know, Tina, you should probably play the drums, is what she said. And so I was like, great. And so I signed up to be a percussionist and just loved it. And I think the coordination from ballet and moving your body and your limbs in different coordinated rhythms, it translated really quickly to drum set for me. But I started on like classical snare drum and classical percussion for a few years. And then when I was 13, started playing the drum set and just loved it and started playing in jazz bands and the Farmington Community Jazz Band, which was like the retiree community in the town I grew up in, had a band that would play for different kinds of dances and events around town. So that's kind of where it all started. And then I started going to summer camps for both classical percussion and for jazz, and Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp on the west side of Michigan. And then they had some international touring programs for high school students that I did twice with the jazz band, which was an incredible opportunity to go and stay in, you know, someone's home in Sweden and then play a bunch of concerts and then tour down to France and play there and go up to Denmark. And it was just an incredible experience. It really sold me on the life of a performing musician.
Sounds like a pretty remarkable childhood.
It was great. Yeah.
I wasn't going to ask you this, but because you mentioned your sister, has she gone the route of being a professional musician as well?
She has. She teaches elementary band, beginning band in Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to kind of just be jumping all over the place. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to start by asking you about your playing, actually. And maybe, I don't know, a lot of musicians don't kind of talk in these kind of abstract terms about their music. So feel free to balk at this question if you want to. But, you know, my own sense of you as a musician is that you have this really wonderful capacity to both like hold a groove and then simultaneously infuse the music with a sense of motion and a sense of forward progress. Are these things you think consciously about? Or if not, can you say what you do think about in regard to your work and your craft?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the compliment. And yeah, those are things I think about. Yeah, there's a couple different like mind frames that I get into when I'm playing. First and foremost, it's to be a supportive structure for the other instrumentalists that are playing. You want the music to feel comfortable. And if it's not grooving, if it's not in time, if it's stiff, it's not comfortable. And so then the other musicians can't relax and can't improvise. I think a lot in textures. I think a lot in complementary and contrary textures. So making sure that whatever I'm playing is complementary to who I'm playing with, but also changing the texture from time to time to give it that momentum, to give the music shape. I think sometimes there's a long-windedness to improvised music that can get mundane, especially for people who aren't really familiar with jazz, right? It's a lot to listen to, it's a lot to take in, and for an extended period of time, it can be a bit much. And so always having a shape to the music and doing something surprising or interesting that brings the listener back in the moment, I think is really important.
Totally. And just because you mentioned sort of the importance of, as a drummer, or maybe as a member of the rhythm section, making the other musicians comfortable, you know, I don't know. I mean, there are these drummers who I really experience as being kind of in the background of the music, but I don't hear you that way at all. I hear you as being as much kind of a voice in the forefront, even though I totally recognize what you're saying too about kind of creating the right space for other musicians to improvise. How do you see yourself in that regard?
Being a drummer and being a drum set player in an improvising ensemble, you're the energetic source of the band. And so I think people who've really kind of come into their own on the instrument and play their personality, that's what comes through. And so for me, I'm kind of bossy. I'm kind of in your face at times. I have a lot of energy that way, and that comes through in my playing, whereas someone who might be a little bit more passive, a little bit more supportive, a little bit more in the background might be that way as a human being. You know, I think a lot of that just comes through. I always say this to my students, my drum set students, when they're in an ensemble, is like, the band responds to your energy from day to day. If you come in and you're angry because you couldn't find parking, you're running late, and your dog was being really slow on their walk or whatever, and you're kind of crabby and you're playing with that kind of, the band feels it, and they might not know why it feels weird today, but then if you come in with a big smile on your face and you're really happy and you're asking everybody how they're doing and you're cracking jokes, the band relaxes and they play in a different way. And just being conscious of how your energy can affect people, particularly from the drum chair, is really important. And you see that away from music, you know, like when you walk into a conversation, if you come in with a bad attitude, it changes the vibe. But for whatever reason, on drums as an instrument, that strictly translates. It's very true that your energy affects the people you're playing with.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think those are things that maybe only musicians really think about. You know, somebody like me, I just show up and, oh, I liked the concert. I didn't like the concert, but I could never come close to putting my finger on, you know, how that connects to the dynamics behind the scenes. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Talking a little more about your playing. Well, so actually the first concert that I attended since the outbreak of COVID was a show at Sam First, which is a jazz bar kind of in the LAX area, the Los Angeles airport area, where you played two sets. I caught the second set, but I think the whole night, well, I'll get to what you were playing in a second, but a friend of mine who was attending the show with me has worked for more than a decade as a live sound engineer, doing sound for all different kinds of groups. And we were kind of reflecting on the concert after the fact. And he made this comment that as a sound person, as a sound engineer, he's constantly dealing with this issue where, especially in small venues, drummers basically can sometimes make his job really difficult, because if they don't have the right touch on their cymbals, the cymbals end up bleeding into all the other, not only the other drum mics, but all the other instrumentalist mics. And then it becomes this thing where it's like, to compensate for that, you maybe have to raise the level of all the other instruments, and then it's too loud. And he was really impressed with, I don't want to say like the softness of your touch on the cymbals, but the control of your touch on the cymbals. That I mean, he made this comment that, yeah, it's really rare to encounter a drummer who kind of plays with that sensibility, or at least plays in a way that kind of makes the sound person's life easier. Can you reflect?
Yeah, for sure. That comes from classical training and concert snare drum technique. Trying to play the correct dynamic of a concert snare drum in a giant orchestral hall calls for a lot of control of volume. And there's a specific book that Delacruz 12 etudes that messes with you and makes you have a lot of control of dynamics on the snare drum, and then taking those concepts and applying them to the drum set, and just applying that kind of musicality to whatever room you're in. That whatever room you're in, you need to be conscious of what it sounds like in every corner of the room, and knowing from even behind the drum set what the entire ensemble is going to sound like, and how far you can push it and how soft you can get. And I agree with you. I think playing with soft volume in a space is something sometimes drummers overlook. And maybe they don't find it as fun as I do, but I think, being able to really draw the listener down and into the music is a really fun element of improvising.
Yeah, it maybe takes a lot of practice and doesn't feel that rewarding to some drummers, but I definitely appreciate it as a listener. It was very cool, very interesting. Speaking of quiet dynamics, I want to talk to you about your brush playing a little bit too, because I was listening through some of your recorded catalog. And, granted, I haven't seen you play live a million times, but I was listening through some of your recording catalog and like, wow, she has a really nice touch with brushes. I don't think I saw you take them out much.
That's so funny you said that, because I do. I love brushes and I love playing with brushes. And I've studied with some really great brush players. I study with Jeff Hamilton, who is just a brush master, and also Joe LaBarbera, who you hear him in all those Bill Evans records with brushes. And then my teacher before them was this guy, John Von Olen, who was really, really dialed into Shelly Mann's brushwork, and was a sort of Mel Lewis disciple, and taught Jeff Hamilton as well. So I come from a long lineage of brush players, and I play a lot of brushes, and I love playing brushes. For whatever reason, at that concert, I just didn't pick them up that much. I don't know. I wasn't hearing that sound as much that night. But I mean, that concert was fun and different, because that was the first time I had played in an indoor space with a live audience in 18 months. And so, the whole thing was a little bit different than what I might have done had I been playing regularly. The music I picked the first set was entirely Thelonious Monk music, and then the second set was all Ornette Coleman. And I picked that because the vibe of that music it lends itself to letting you go anywhere you want. There's less pressure to, like, if it was all my music, I know as someone who plays other people's original music, sometimes there's so much pressure to get it right for that person. I didn't feel like I wanted to put the other musicians under that pressure, especially since Beth was flying in from San Francisco that day. Richard Giddens had driven in from Fresno. We didn't rehearse. And so I wanted to give a really clear and strong framework and attitude and just vibe for each set and for each piece that would kind of bring us all together into a feeling, into an attitude that then we could just go with it from there. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so I want to go back to something we were talking about before, but first, because now you mentioned Ornette, I've got to ask you, I mean, just such a foundational figure in this music. Would you care to say a few words about the music and the musical legacy of Ornette Coleman?
So Ornette is someone I admire so deeply for having a unique perspective on music and a unique compositional style and a unique improvisational style that at the time was pretty unpopular. And I think we see this today we see it all across jazz history, of older generations looking at what a new generation is doing and going, what is this? You are ruining the music. How could you? And yet the younger generation perseveres. And I have been lucky enough to play with Bobby Bradford, who played with Ornette, and was lucky enough to study with Charlie Haden, who also played with Ornette. And hearing these musicians talk about what music means and what the avant-garde means, and that this avant-garde, subgenre of jazz was not about making a beautiful piece of music. It was about playing your life. And sometimes life is uncomfortable, and sometimes life doesn't fit into a 32 bar form. And so, having these shapes of melodies and these shapes of improvisation sections, and using that as the motivation to create something, that really resonates with me, that life isn't always as tidy as a structured form in a cycle. I just appreciate that approach to the music.
I think that's a wonderful observation, and I had never really heard that description of Ornette's music, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, it definitely fits the bill, as they say. Well, you mentioned Bobby Bradford and Charlie Haden. Obviously, we're going to have to loop back and talk about them because they're two just such monumental figures in this music. But before we do that, I don't want to get too far away from the fact that you had mentioned your experience playing classical music. I want to ask you a little more about that, and specifically, is that a field that you've delved into recently, or is that just kind of in your training but not in your daily ongoing practice?
Great question. The last classical gig I did, I got to play timpani with Evanescence at the Greek Theater a couple years in a row, which was so fun and so right up my alley, because it was like syncopated timpani that had to line up with a rock rhythm section, and they were like, yeah, you feel the pocket, which is like you're playing in the way that a drum set player would, which made me feel great. I don't do a lot of that kind of work anymore. I'm not known in Los Angeles for doing that. So I have an undergraduate degree in classical percussion, in addition to a jazz studies undergraduate degree that I got from Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, which is the longest name of a school ever. But I studied there with a group of 3 percussionists called Percussion Group Cincinnati, Al Oddie, Rusty Burge, and Jim Cully, who are some of the best musicians I've ever met, and specialized in John Cage trio music and new percussion music. And they were so inspiring to be around. And Rusty is also a great jazz vibraphonist. So it was, I was seeing someone who was kind of doing both things. And I wasn't opposed to doing percussion work, but when I moved out here, I just didn't tell anyone I did that, because sometimes when you do more than one thing, they take you less seriously at both of those things. So I was teaching a lot of classical percussion at Los Angeles City College. And they're suggesting that maybe once in a while at CSUN, I'll take on a classical percussion student, especially one who might be doing music ed and needs to do a little bit of drum set too. But playing wise, it kind of seems like the only things that get thrown my way out here are some sort of crossover pop percussion thing, which is awesome. I'm so down to do that.
Well, so you had mentioned Bobby Bradford a couple of minutes back. And I've seen you play with him a number of times. Always really stunning shows. There was this, especially this, the one that sticks out really strongly in my mind was this suite that he composed, or that he was commissioned to compose in tribute to Jackie Robinson for, I think, Jackie Robinson's 100th birthday celebration, called "Stealing Home." Would you mind talking about that piece a little bit, and also just about your general work with Bobby Bradford?
Bobby is the absolute best. He is an incredible musician, an incredible composer, a wonderful teacher, a great human. I am always in awe of being around him and playing with him and learning from him. And he wrote this suite that kind of follows Jackie's career path, where it starts and it's kind of this, he's in the Army and he's this captain, but people aren't taking him seriously because it was very rare to have a Black captain in the Army at that time. And then he's playing in the minors. There's a piece called Up from the Minors that was really, really dissonant and really just intentionally a struggle. And again, that's the music is supposed to reflect the life experience. So as a listener, you're hearing a lot of chaos and a lot of loud sounds and aggression and angular sounds. And that's because that time in Jackie's life was very angular. It was very combative. He was going through a lot. And then it kind of comes back together with a more kind of swinging piece. So Bobby took a lot of time to think about what it must have been like to be Jackie playing baseball as one of the first, if I think he was the first African American to play in the major leagues.
He was, yeah.
Felt like. So it was really cool to see how Bobby composed those feelings into the music.
Yeah, such a wonderful player and composer. And then you also mentioned that you studied under Charlie Haden. I wonder if you could mention maybe just a few of the more significant things that you feel like you learned from him, or just reflect on him as an artist.
Charlie was one of the most beautiful musicians I've ever been in the presence of. He taught a course at CalArts called The Spirituality of Improvisation. And so you go in and every class you didn't know what you were going to talk about, if you were going to talk about being on tour and what it was like to stay in 5-star hotels, or if he was going to talk about the latest record he was working on with Lee Konitz and Brad Meldau and how he didn't like how he sounded on any of it, or if he was going to put on a classical symphony and at a certain point of the music turn it down and say, man, if I could write like that, I wouldn't talk to anybody. Or have you play Ornette Coleman tunes. I learned Broken Shadows from Charlie, or play some of his own music. And whatever he would give as feedback was always somewhat abstract. There was one day where he was telling another musician in the room, man, you got to play the mountains. You look over there, there's like a big picture window in this classroom at CalArts. And he's like, see those mountains? You've got to play like that. And so then you leave and you're like, what does that mean? Playing the mountains. How do I practice that? Sorry, my dog is taking a nap and if you hear any scuffling.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear it, but no problem.
But he was always such a humble teacher. I know, if you talk to other musicians that toured with him or people that worked with him, he had a reputation for sometimes being a bit difficult. But as an educator, he gave us his full attention. He, really invested his time in listening to us and giving us, what does it mean to play the mountains? I don't know that it matters if you ever pinpoint it, but that you start thinking about it, it puts you in a different headspace to play, which I think was probably the point.
Yeah, it's amazing for a teacher to be able to kind of share their own inner world or inner experience with the students, whereas a lot of people are just trying to teach form or craft or something like that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, so as you said, it was at CalArts that you were studying under Mr. Haden. What was it like to practice and kind of build up your musicianship in that environment?
The best. It was the best ever. CalArts is an amazing community and environment. There's a lot of freedom, especially as a master's student. So, my schedule was taking a modern dance class, which was great, getting kind of back to my roots as a dancer, and then also improvising as a dancer, and then composition with Leo Wadada Smith, which was looking at his graphic scores and talking about he composed music that went along with his dreams, and musical moments in pieces, and finding those to music we liked, and then Charlie's course, and then Joe LaBarbera's course on jazz history. I mean, can you get any closer to this source? And then ensemble wise, you're required to play in at least one ensemble with students, and then you're put into a group with a faculty member who plays with you. And so I had this practice space there. Oh, and African drumming with Alfred Ladzekpo, who is a hero of mine as well. I had this practice space right across from the African room. I would go in and maybe practice a couple hours before class, and then go to class and be around all these incredible students and teachers, and then go into the African drum room and learn all these complicated rhythms and songs and dances, and then go to dance class, and then lay in the grass and take a nap or play some frisbee or some kub, which is this Swedish block game that a bunch of us played, and then, at the end of the day, go back to the African room and jam until 2:00 in the morning. So it was just this immersive, open, collective environment. Sometimes in music school, when you have all these different ensembles and they have you audition for which band you're going to be in, there's this like competitive feeling that I think is really unhealthy. It can be really unhealthy in terms of allowing you to appreciate other people on your instrument, because you feel like you're in such competition with them that you don't want to hear them play, or you don't want them to hear you play because you don't want them to steal your shit. And CalArts kind of just negated all of those kinds of weird dynamics of college, because there were no auditions. You picked the groups you wanted to play in with the students, and they assigned you the groups with the faculty based on what they think would be good for you. And in the African drumming class, you got to play with all the other drum set players, which never happens, and you got to all hang out and enjoy each other's company. And so it was just this really open and nurturing environment that, not that CCM was a bad environment, but it was a more traditional, structured, competitive kind of vibe.
Well, so in your last answer, you mentioned Joe LaBarbera and Alfred Ladzekpo, who are both people I was going to ask about. Let's start with Ladzekpo, and then you can talk about LaBarbera after.
Alfred reminded me that I loved playing music and that I was good at it. I think that I had forgotten that before I went into my master's. I went straight from my undergraduate program into my master's, and I'm just going to remind you that I did this double performance degree in classical percussion and jazz, which in order to do that, I had to do summer school every year for 4 years to finish in 4 years. So I was burnt out on school, and I was burnt out on music. I felt like I'd eaten chocolate cake every day for 4 years straight. It was just too much. And I'd also forgotten, it felt like work, it felt like putting together recitals and playing concerts with guest artists and all of these things. It felt like work. And so getting to CalArts and doing something as non-traditional as West African drumming, which jazz musicians should learn. That's where the rhythm comes from in our music. But learning by ear and not looking at a page, and sitting with Alfred and having him play a rhythm at me and me playing it back, and then learning the next one, and him saying to me, "You're really good at this," was really just refreshing to hear. And it built my confidence and reminded me that, oh yeah, I'm good at this. I'm a great drummer, and I am natural to music, and this is something I love to do. Was really, really special. And after he retired, I went out and visited him in Ghana with another drummer, Trevor Andrews, and a friend of mine who taught yoga with me. I taught yoga for a few years too. As one does when you move to Los Angeles, you start doing a lot of yoga and then you start teaching. But that was a whole other experience too, to go and be in his village and do a dawn processional on Easter with him and his family playing the drums, and just an incredible person, and someone I feel so fortunate to know and have in my corner.
Before we move on to Joe LaBarbera, can you actually talk a little bit more about your visit to Ghana? I'm curious, especially because I lived there for about 1.5 years.
You did?
Almost
Wow.
a decade ago, but yeah.
What part? Accra?
I was in Accra, but I actually lived in an Ewe house in Accra, so I went to the Volta region several times.
Wow. Yeah, he's a chief in Anyako.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I didn't know he was a chief. Wow.
Yeah, like we got to sit and watch him kind of dispute some cases on his front porch. We didn't know what they were saying because they were all in Ewe, but it was fascinating, That trip was mind-blowing. Ghana is an incredible country. I don't even know what to say. We started in Accra and went to that arts village by the beach where they have the drum circles and they make the drums, and I bought a drum and we hung out with those guys and went to some of their drumming sessions, which were this kind of younger hybrid drumming experience where they add djembes and the dance moves are much more elaborate, which was actually something Alfred is cautious about because he thinks it can take away from the tradition, right? Which I think is actually a really interesting thing to be aware of in terms of, even in jazz, the old school, this is the way it is, and then the new school, well, it can include synthesizers and, whatever else. It's just, it's always interesting to see how those kinds of arguments show up in other parts of the world with other types of music. And so we started there, and there was one day where we were trying to figure out how to get a cell phone with a SIM card so that we can communicate with people, because it was before all of our iPhones had global networking, and trying to find an internet cafe so that our loved ones knew that we made it there safely. And
I totally went through the exact same thing.
yeah. It's like, how do we do this? And now if you just use your iPhone, it'd be fine. Just like, oh. But we got to visit the University of Accra and sit in on some of their dancing and drumming courses. From there, we went out to the Gold Coast, right, where there's the
Cape Coast,
where there's the Cape Coast Castle, is that what it's called? It's where people were held before they were shipped to the Americas, with the door of no return.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an incredibly moving experience to see firsthand, where people were taken from their villages and sometimes offered up, different tribes would offer up the people who had misbehaved in their communities to go to the Americas as enslaved people, and not because they knew. I mean, heavens, if they had known, they would not have offered up these people if they had known what they were going to go through. But to see the handwritten plots of how to store bodies in ships to be shipped across the Americas, it was a really heavy experience seeing all of that firsthand. I have a whole slideshow that I showed in my jazz history class. There's a moment where you're down in the dungeon of the men's dungeon, where they had excavated the floor all the way down to the brick, and the tour guide is standing on like 4 inches of what they sampled to find out to be just human components. I mean, just horrific. And when you see that kind of thing firsthand, it makes it that much more real. It makes it feel less part of history and more part of your own experience with history and with the music. To know that the music went through that kind of tragic human experience. It was definitely life-changing.
It's a bit like, sorry to interrupt, but it's a bit like visiting a concentration camp or something, right?
Yes, it changes your perspective. It makes it much more real, and you understand, I think, more on a visceral level, the horrors of it all. Alfred also took us to get an Afa reading. Afa is one of the religions there, and that was a crazy experience. Trevor's reading was like, "Oh, you're a very rich man. You'll always be a very rich man. You should have a better relationship with your father, but you'll always be a rich man." And my friend Priscilla's was like, "Oh, you're on a wonderful path, and there might be someone who's trying to stab you in the back a little in your studies, but you're going to be fine. It's going to be fine." And mine was like, "You have dark omens. You are in grave danger. Don't swim in lakes, rivers, or streams for the next 2 years and pay us $200 to sacrifice a chicken, a duck, and a goat. And here's some incense to burn underneath a shroud so that you rid yourself of all these demons." It's like,
did you go through with the sacrifice?
Of course I did.
Yeah,
of course I did. And of course I burned the incense. I'm not messing with that.
Yeah, they take marine spirits very seriously out there.
And it was true. I had this moment where we were standing on the rocks. We had stayed at this hotel, I think it was called the Beachcomber, which was like these little beach huts along the beach outside of Accra, and there was water going through the rocks and it looked like a snake. And I was telling them about that, and they were like, "You're in grave danger." And then we ended up in Anyako with Alfred and his family, and played drums every night, and ate in his house and stayed in his house and met his whole family and met the village elders. And we left Easter, and on the morning of Easter we did a dawn processional with his family, and stopped along the village and played the pieces we knew, and then took off. And I didn't even know, when you go through a life-changing experience, it takes you a while to process, like, how do I even describe what I just went through?
Totally amazing. No, that was a great answer. So yeah, just with no style, just dumping back into the interview, do you want to talk about Joe LaBarbera a little bit?
Sure. Joe is like my dad, my musical dad. Also a wonderful human to have in my corner. When I got to CalArts, I was trying to play like one of my other heroes, Jeff Hamilton, and trying to be sort of rudimentally based rudimentally based in my playing and very structured and kind of by the book. And Joe really opened up my playing. He's like, you should go listen to a bunch of Sonny Rollins and learn how to phrase around the drums like a horn player. And in our lessons, even just him and I just trading, we're playing over a tune together, and me hearing how to phrase in a more open manner was really, really helpful for me to get out of trying to play licks. It's like the difference of hearing a player who's practiced a bunch of licks versus someone who's actually playing what they're hearing in the moment. And Joe was so, so helpful with that for me. And just, he was a great person to take lessons from, really methodical, really clear in his assignments, which I appreciate, really supportive. The first semester I was at CalArts, he had broken his left hand in a bicycling accident. So I got to play in the ensemble that he would have normally played drums in. It was a total bummer for him, and it was a bummer that he was broken, but it was actually a really wonderful teaching moment for me, because I was playing in his group and he was basically my shoulder angel, being like, why did you do that just now? Why did you play so loud over the bass solo? What are you thinking? And that was so helpful, because so many times you're taking lessons with these musicians, but they never really hear you play that much. And so for him to hear me once a week in an ensemble and in our lessons, I think he got really familiar with my playing and where the moments were in my playing that I really needed to focus on. It was an incredible experience.
That's very cool. Picking up kind of, or staying with the CalArts connection a little bit, you seem to have quite a few titles out on Daniel Rosenboom's Orenda label. And I say a CalArts connection because I assume maybe that's where you guys met each other. I know that he is also an alumnus of that school. So you've got some stuff out as a leader and a co-leader there. You've got a lot of stuff as a side musician. Do you have any sentiments to share regarding that label, or that kind of, I don't know if I could really call it like a sub scene or something, but.
Yeah, it's a community in and of itself that Dan has really been the spearhead of. He's really brought a group of, interesting, avant-garde, kind of left field artists together in a way that maybe we wouldn't have been able to do on our own. He's really been incredible in promoting the music and finding a home for our music, and just putting it all together in a place and making it marketable in a way that I don't think any of us knew how to do on our own. So he's incredible. He's got a work ethic like nobody I've ever met. He's always got like 15 projects in the air, and his practice regimen is so admirable. He's an incredible musician and businessman and person. Yeah.
Keeping with the theme of the LA music scene a little bit, I wonder if you'd care to reflect at all on the amazing and now sadly defunct venue, the Blue Whale in Little Tokyo, and maybe any kind of cherished memories that you made there.
So many. The Blue Whale was the heart and soul of the progressive music scene in Los Angeles. And June, if you're listening to this, please come back and help us out. We need you. I have so many memories there, the jam sessions, and they would turn the air conditioning off so everybody would get really sweaty, and you go up to play and you just be grossly sweaty. There was one jam session. I think it was a Monk Institute session. I think it was still the Thelonious Monk Institute that was hosting it. And subconsciously, and this happens frequently at jam sessions, and I don't know why, and it's infuriating, but subconsciously, frequently at jam sessions, men who are running the sessions will have all the women musicians in the room play together. They're like, great, now the ladies played, let's get back to it. But it was me and Carmen Staff and Emma Dayhuff, I think, this great bass player.
She's awesome.
And we saw this happen. We were on the bandstand together, and I think 3 of us collectively were like, this noise, we're amazing, let's throw down. And we just went for it. And after that, Walter Smith called me and Emma up and was like, let's play, which was a huge compliment. So that was a great memory. There's another night where, I think all of the late night hangs where you ended up at the bar with Kenny or Daryl Swords serving you at the end of the night, and just shooting the with musicians and your friends there. Hanging with Benny Maupin at the bar was always really fun, or Darek or Larry. There was one time Kathleen Grace was doing a show there, and I convinced, I think both Kenny and Daryl, I paid for it, but I convinced them to take up the whole band shots in like the middle of the set. That was really fun. Yeah, I miss that place. I miss that place dearly. Playing John Armstrong's big band music there was a thrill. Playing Lauren Baba's big band music there was a thrill. My own CD release there was standing room only, and just hanging out with people and feeling supported by a community in that room was always wonderful. Orchestra Meze, when they clear out the center of the floor and everybody be dancing, and I took off my shoes and was dancing, and some of my students from LACC were there, and they thought I had lost my mind because I took my shoes off. I was like, no, we're dancing. Yeah. It's a great place. We're going to miss it. I don't even know if we feel the total impact of not being there yet.
Yeah, I mean, with things sort of just starting to slowly open up, I don't think we have. But with the Blue Whale gone, where do you like to play in LA? And in general, are there sort of types of gigs that you prefer, that you like less?
Sam First is a great venue. Dave Robert is doing a great job keeping that roster interesting and serving multiple sub-communities of the scene. The Falls, I'm playing at the Falls tonight for the jam session. That's a great cooperative community of a space. There's not a whole lot else going on right now. The Baked Potato, although I don't play there frequently. It's been a few years. Vibrato, although again, I haven't played there recently. I think it will be interesting to see what else gets started and what else opens back up. Yeah, I think a thing that happens a lot in LA, more so than maybe some other communities, are house jams. I've had a lot of people come over to my house to play since it's felt safe to do, and gone over to other people's places to play, and just kind of get back to it and remember how to do it, and speak the language again a bit, because it takes a while to feel comfortable again. It's been funny sort of re-engaging with the community, and the first 2 or 3 sessions you do, everybody is like in their head and like, oh man, I'm a terrible musician. But after a few times you get back to it. I did a LACMA concert too with John Tegmeyer recently, and that was one of the first concerts any of us had done in months too. And so at the time we were all like, oh man, we sound terrible. And then listening back to it now, it's like, oh no, that was actually really wonderful. But that's always a wonderful space to play, especially when it's live, with the live audience there. And the dance zones on either side, they have roped off areas. It's like, you can only dance in here. And those beautiful light posts in the background, it's always just a beautiful spot.
Yeah, that outdoor area where the audience is like under the awning. And
exactly, yeah.
I've definitely seen some cool shows there. Well, I'm going to ask you some more questions about the LA jazz scene later, but for now I want to shift and ask you about your work as an educator.
Sure.
I mentioned sort of at the beginning, I guess in the intro to the interview, that you taught at LACC from 2014 to 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and now you're the director of jazz studies at CSUN. Mm-hmm. I know that a lot of musicians teach kind of to pay the bills, But oftentimes I find that like people who go to the extent of like becoming faculty at a school or something have a deeper feeling about the importance of passing the knowledge on to the next generation of players. I don't know. I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Yeah. As a woman in the jazz industry, there are not a lot of instrumental women who teach. And for me, in some of my education, that was really alienating and really lonely. And so there is a part of me that feels obligated to teach, so that women see that there are other women in the music scene and in the music education scene, so that women coming up in the program feel supported and have someone to talk to that may understand their perspective more than a male teacher. And also that just the vibe changes in school. There's still a very macho, aggressive tone to a lot of jazz micro communities, and making those more open and more accepting and more welcoming to people of all backgrounds and preferences and genders and everything in between, is the wave of the future. You even see it with the generation that's coming through school. And I think for a lot of programs, if the educators don't realize that and don't actively start to change the environment, we're going to alienate the students that want to improvise, and they're going to go other places. So I'm really passionate about that, about creating safe and open and welcoming environments in jazz education, because I did not always feel welcome in my school experience.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things you just said that I want to sort of highlight, I guess. I mean, first of all, your use of the term jazz industry, whereas a lot of people will say jazz scene. I think that's a really important distinction to make, that people are dedicating their lives to this work, and it's art, but it is work, right? People are trying to live, people are trying to pay the bills, people are pouring just dozens and hundreds of hours into this practice, and there is this kind of I guess maybe even more on the East Coast, but sort of in general, there is this idea that like, or at least a stereotype that comes to somebody like me as an outsider, that it's like in the jazz world, there's like this idea that, oh, somebody was a jerk to me when I was learning the music, and so I have to be a jerk to you because that's how the music is taught. But then if you're the only woman in the room or the only whatever in the room, that has to be, even to, again, borrow a word from your own answer, it has to be very alienating.
Yeah. And understanding the stereotype threat of it. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Stereotype threat is when you are of a community or of a defining factor that is frequently stereotyped. For example, if you are a woman and you're a math major, but the generalization of women is that they're bad at math, you constantly have that stereotype in your head. You know that that's a stereotype. And so then that is like an underlying thought in your brain as you're trying to do whatever it is you're trying to do. And then sometimes that can make you fulfill the stereotype because you're distracted. You can't actually focus on what you're trying to do. And I think in jazz, there is a stereotype that women are not as good, are not as aggressive in the music, or are not as accomplished theoretically. And when you have that stereotype in your brain as a woman, and especially as a young woman who's still trying to figure out your strengths and find your identity, it's really difficult to go through a program and to feel like you're being marginalized, and to execute all of the things that your male counterpoints are doing. And they don't have to think about that stuff. They're just like, well, of course I'm good at this. I'm a man. Or not even necessarily that. They just don't even have those kinds of thoughts because it's not even a thought in their mind.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't know, just one more kind of reflection that you just brought up for me. When you do think of a lot of the, quote unquote, great women in jazz history, there's a lot of keyboard players. I mean, there's the singers and then there's the keyboardists, Mary Lou Williams, Alice Coltrane, Marian McPartland, et cetera, et cetera. You being a drummer are kind of blazing a trail here to some extent, right?
Yeah, I'm following in the footsteps of Cindy Blackman and Terry Lynn Carrington and Allison Miller, but it's a shorter list than some others, for sure. There's also just traditionally there's more acceptance of women playing piano or being vocalists than doing something as masculine as playing the drums, which you see me rolling my eyes, like instruments are not gendered.
Right.
Yeah, and especially when I was living in the Midwest, it was more of a shock for audiences to see me playing drums, and I felt at times a bit like a sideshow act, like Tina, the drumming wonder, as opposed to just doing what I do because that's who I am. And Los Angeles has been healthy for me in that way, that it seems that the community, and not just the community, but the audiences are a little bit more aware and understanding and progressive in their view.
Mm, mm. Um, I want to ask one more question about your work as an educator, because I mentioned that you taught at LACC, Los Angeles City College, which, that's an institution that, if I'm not mistaken, I think Mingus went through there, Charles Mingus, Eric Dolphy went through there, and a bunch of other greats. So any thoughts on what it means to have made yourself a part of the history of this great historic institution?
It was very humbling. And especially when I got that job and was playing with some older musicians around town, it seemed like everybody spent a little bit of time at LACC. You'd move to LA. If you wanted to get into the movie arranging industry, you'd go take a couple arranging courses at LACC or play in the band just to kind of network. It was not dissimilar to what it would feel like to go to the Union. And it was just very humbling to be a part of that history. I wish that I could have done more over there. I wish that I could have grown the program more. But when an opportunity knocks to bump up, so to speak, it was hard to turn down. LACC has some wonderful jazz teachers over there. Barbara Laranga, Yashi Hampton's there, Nate Light. They've got a great crew of teachers over there, as does CSUN, but CSUN had never had a female jazz instrumental teacher teach over there, part-time, let alone full-time. So it was exciting to jump into that over at CSUN.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So shifting back to sort of just, I guess, more general questions about you as a player. I wonder if you could talk about the difference in your experience as a leader, and you've led small ensembles made up of a lot of different great musicians, versus playing in the rhythm section in other people's groups, or if the similarities are greater than the differences, then we could talk about that.
I hate being a band leader, if I'm going to be honest. It's so hard because you're not just responsible for the music, you're responsible for the gig and the travel and the pay and all of those kinds of minutia. So sometimes it feels like the last thing you get to think about is the music. And I'm not a prolific composer. So I don't have a book of Tina Raymond originals that I have rehearsed with my own group that are at the ready. But I would prefer not to be a band leader. If I don't have to, I much prefer supporting someone else's vision and letting them call the shots and just focusing on their music and making their music, come into fruition of their vision. But sometimes it does feel like if you want something done, you've got to do it yourself. And so when the opportunities have come up where it's been asked that I be a band leader, I make it work. My record was a unique project for me in that it was actually something I really wanted to do and felt really strongly about, and was willing to put a band together and be the leader and promote the music and do all of that. And I want to do that again. I will, but it gets harder the more you realize how difficult it is to be the one calling the shots. You have to make all the decisions, and then you're responsible. I took a quartet to South Korea in 2019, fall 2019, And one of the musicians ate something that they didn't know that they were allergic to and went into anaphylactic shock. It was terrifying, and luckily they survived and everything was fine, but we missed a gig because we were in the ambulance, and so then it's like, well, then the festival is going to dock the pay, and that all comes down to you when you're the leader. You have to take care of all of that, and how do you handle that? And those kinds of things are stressful. So I would prefer to not have to deal with those things. I would prefer to just be in the band.
Yeah, fair enough. Can't argue with that. I wonder if you would mind saying a few words about like the source of your creativity or the nature of your creativity, because well, I don't know, when you're taking a solo, for instance, where do your ideas come from? Because you seem to be generating these kind of incredible ideas that I mean, even in a live setting, if I can't listen back, I can tell, oh, this would really hold up to several repeat listens.
Cool. Thank you. The melody and melodic content are where my brain tends to go, phrasing, and then complementing that with traditional vocabulary. It's kind of hearing the melody, playing a abstract reference of the melody on the drums, and throwing in the natural vocabulary that either I've evolved playing with or have learned from the masters, from the Philly Joe and the Max Roach recordings and the Art Blakey recordings, and honoring the tradition, but then also breaking it. I think that's kind of my philosophy on jazz in general, is you learn the tradition and you appreciate the tradition, and then you destroy it and turn it into something new that's yours. And so that's what I strive to do as a player and an improviser, is to take the melodic content of a song, to take the phrase structure of a song, to just take phrase structures in general, like speech patterns, and use that as a source of inspiration on what's already a very abstract instrument. I mean, drums, you're referencing shapes, you're referencing harmony, you're referencing melodic ideas. So.
Yeah. One of the few questions I have prepared that's not totally explicitly about music. I read in a piece that was, I don't know, from a couple of years back, maybe about 2017 or so, that your father is or has been a labor attorney, and your grandparents have worked as teachers and are strongly pro-union. I couldn't gather from the piece if any of them had been union members themselves. And you're also originally, as you mentioned at the top of the interview, from the Detroit metro area, which is a town with a very strong union history. So I wonder if you could explain how your family life, and specifically your family's kind of socio-political outlook, have influenced the person and the artist that you've become.
Yeah, both of my grandparents were teachers union members. I have a great grandfather who was involved in the UAW sit-down strike on the assembly lines. My dad is a labor lawyer, so he represents unions, but as a lawyer, you don't belong to the union, but you represent them. I am a proud CFA member. I was an AFT member, and I'm a member of the Musicians Union as well, which I think technically you're not supposed to be in two unions at the same time, but they can come get me. And I think just hearing from my family growing up that the support and the strength of organized labor, and what that means for your pension and what that means for your security, and if you need to go on medical leave, that it's important to support each other as a community in whatever career path you're in, that you cannot always trust your employers to have your best interest in mind, and that it's always a balance. There are some unions that go too far, and there are some employers that go too far. And so finding that ideal balance is what it's supposed to be about. Does anyone ever find the ideal balance? No. But it's working toward that more perfect situation. No pun intended, the more perfect union. Oh, I can't believe I did that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It happens to the best of us. Let's see. You've also picked up a number of endorsements from very prominent instrument makers, namely Sabian, Regal Tip, and Remo. Could you talk a little bit about how that came to be, and what effect, if any, that's had on your career as a musician?
Sure. With Sabian and Remo, I am an educator, endorsed educator. So that's been incredibly helpful because if I need gear for schools, they're always very, very giving. Same with Remo. I said that. Regal Tip. Regal Tip I met at NAMM, which is a big instrument show that happens down in Anaheim every winter. And Jeff Hamilton is endorsed by them, and I use his sticks and brushes exclusively. So he introduced me, and a lot of these instrument companies don't have a lot of women jazz drummers on their rosters, so they're kind of open and receptive to that. Remo, I met Bruce Jacoby, who unfortunately is no longer with Remo since the pandemic, but I met him at NAMM as well. I think I was introduced by another great drummer, Aron Serfati. And the education deal that they have with giving, drum heads to institutions and individuals is really gracious and helpful when you've got limited budgets. And Sabian, the cymbal representative, his last name is escaping me, but Nick was actually an instructor of mine at Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp when I was 12, and taught me how to play crash cymbals correctly and suspended cymbal rolls. And so I went up to him at NAMM and said, I'm sure you don't remember me, but this is who I am and I'm teaching here. And he said, call me or, send me an email. And so I did. And Jeff Hamilton's cymbals, which are what I use, are also made by Sabian, the Crescent series. And so that was also another connection that worked in my favor. So
wow, that's one of those really full circle stories. That's very cool.
It's a very small community. You run into everybody at some point. So, yeah.
Well, I want to ask if we can do a little kind of lightning round where I just kind of mention the name of one of your collaborators, current or past, and you can just kind of, I don't know, say whatever pops into your head.
Sure.
Let's see. I'll just kind of start from a random place on the list. Kris Tyner.
Kris is awesome. Kris is the jazz director at Bakersfield College. He has a beautiful variety of articulations and timbres on the trumpet. He plays with the Cathlene Pineda quartet. That's how we were introduced to each other. He is someone that I have leaned on heavily through the pandemic in terms of teaching online. There's a good crew of us, also Richard Giddens up at Fresno and John Armstrong out in Idaho, where we're all trying these different methods online, and we check in with each other. And we're like, did this work for you? And invariably we're all like, no, it didn't work. That didn't work at all. And I'm like, great. Okay. So it's not just me. So yeah, a huge support in my life, and an incredible musician, and even as incredible of a teacher. Yeah, Kris is amazing.
And I mean, just an aside, I've heard some of his work playing kind of microtonal stuff on the trumpet. Really out there.
It's gorgeous. Yeah.
Amazing. You mentioned Cathlene Pineda. Let's talk about her.
Cathlene is one of my favorite humans and one of my best friends. She released a record last year that kind of commemorated a miscarriage that she had. She puts her heart and soul into her music. Her writing is some of my favorite music to play. She's a gorgeous composer and pianist, and is so sincere and sensitive. When we play together, it frequently feels like we share a brain. We finish each other's thoughts. There's this symbiosis that I think when you play with someone a lot, you just start to hear music in the same way. And I think maybe even if you don't play music a lot, but you're very close with someone, that you know their mannerisms so well, you know when they look a little bit to one side, you know what that means. And so playing with someone that you know that well is really, really special.
Amazing. Yeah, it's as a listener, it's always really special to hear musicians who have established that kind of sense of conversationality between them. And yeah, that record that you're referring to is really great. Everybody should check it out who's listening to this. I want to mention another name that you brought up earlier in the interview Darek Oleszkiewicz.
Yeah, one of my favorite bass players in town. He and a pianist from Poland, Kuba Stankiewicz, who they went to like grade school together. They've known each other forever, have sort of adopted me into their Polish American trio, and they gave me a Polish name. I'm Krisha Raymond when I play with them.
Okay, nice.
I mean, I'm still, but anyway.
I know, I get it.
Okay, good. And man, that is just like the most. Well, Darek is one of the most solid bass players to play with, and his intonation is spot on always. And Kuba only plays the right thing at the right time. There's nothing additional about his playing ever. It's always just perfectly beautiful and simplistic. And so playing in that group is really fun to play with space and with arrangements, and with just a concept of less is more. And that group played at Carnegie Hall a few years ago in the recital hall. I went to Poland and played with Kuba and another Polish bass player for one winter for a couple weeks, which was so fun. Darek is just another, he was a teacher of mine at CalArts as well, and I played in his combo there. And then he brought me into this trio project with him and Kuba, and he's the best. I mean, again, like this kind of ties back to CalArts, where all of those teachers were just so supportive. And me playing with Bobby, that happened through Vinny Golia, who was one of my teachers at CalArts. So it's like all roads lead back to CalArts for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Vinny Golia too. So let's talk about him right now.
He's the best. He's a zany, interesting, quirky, incredible artist, and he is an artist in the true sense. He was a visual artist before he picked up playing reed instruments, and his compositions are damn near impossible to play accurately, but the struggle of trying to get them right is part of the fun. And I really learned how to play free playing with Vinny at CalArts, and learning how to drop the filter of, and now I'm going to play free jazz, and letting go and listening and really responding in the moment and hearing in the moment. I learned that from Vinny. So, yeah.
I want to ask about someone else who I think is a CalArts alum and who kind of came up at the very beginning of this interview, Beth Schenck.
Beth is rad. I did not meet Beth at CalArts. I met her, we were teaching for a summer program together that was started by Ivan Johnson, who is a CalArts alumni. And Beth is CalArts alumni, but she graduated a little bit before me. And the summer program called ACE, which was hosted at the Oakwood School in North Hollywood, Beth and her husband came down and taught for, and I was teaching for, and Cathlene was teaching for. A bunch of us taught for this program for a long period of time. I met her there, and then there was a collective of faculty for that, and that's the first time we played together. And she's got such an interesting approach to the instrument. She played with Henry Threadgill and lived in New York in a long time, and she's a really great listener. She plays in the moment. There's a difference between saxophonists who play on top of the music, well, instrumentalists who play on top of the music, and it's like they've prepared what they're going to say or what they're going to play, almost like a monologue. Like, what's coming next, but there's no room for interaction or for taking them off course. And Beth is truly like speaking in the moment and playing in the moment and listening to what the band is doing around her and going with what's happening in the moment. And those are the kinds of musicians I love to play with, because I want things to move. I want things to feel flexible. I want to feel like I'm part of the conversation. Not an Ebersol backing track,
She also just has such wonderful ideas on her instrument. A few more names, if I may. Let's see. How about David Tranchina?
Dave is a beautiful bass player, incredible composer. His record that came out last summer, The Ogre, is wild. And learning that music gave me so much anxiety, because it's so kind of lopsided at times, and not natural phrasing, odd phrasing. And then he told us that he was writing that music. He had broken his arm from a bicycle accident where someone opened the car door as he was driving, and he flipped over and broke his arm and was in bed. And then he told us that he had written that music while he was on painkillers recovering from that. And then it all made sense of like where the music came from. Dave is the best to travel with. Dave loves traveling and is just joyful as a travel companion. He's really good at meeting new people, and new people seem to love him, which is just, it's always really helpful. I'm a little less engaging when I meet people for the first time. Sometimes I'm a little more standoffish. And so having someone like Dave around where he's just all smiles and welcoming is really helpful for me to break up my shyness.
I want to ask you about Art Land, who I think did play on that album that you put out a couple of years ago that we talked about some minutes ago.
Yeah, Art Lande and I go way back.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I met Art Lande in Cincinnati. He did a master class at CCM where he was just one of the most interesting artists we had visit. He like recited poetry and did these sort of weird acting skits in between pieces of music, and thought about improvising and thought about music as a holistic experience, not just music. And we had a conversation about what I was working on, and I told him I was working on playing in a big band, but also within the arrangement of a big band, working on making the small group, soloists within a big band piece feel movable and have shape, that it wasn't just like big band, solo, big band. It was more like a solo, a small group within a large ensemble. And he remembered that. And then fast forward to when I was at CalArts, he would do these week-long immersion sessions in the winter at CalArts. So we reconnected there. And his improvisation courses were really helpful in thinking about improvisation as a life experience, and hearing all sounds in nature and in life as inspiration, and taking speech patterns and taking storylines and making those sonic experiences, like let's improvise a forest together. You be the birds, I'll be the trees. What does that sound like? And so Art and I just became friends through that experience. Certainly he's still a mentor of mine, but a friend. And a few years after I had graduated, even after I graduated, he would let me know every time he was going to be in town and would ask if I wanted to play a bit or come up and hang out. And so he sent me a message, I guess December before I made my record, and said, I'm coming out in January. I have time to play, would love to hang out and talk and have some food and play. And that was right after the previous election when Donald Trump was elected. And I was feeling very sad and very frustrated. And there's this piece, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that I started hearing a 12-tone row underneath. So it was this sort of Americana song with this eerie chaos underneath it. And I was like, Art would sound amazing on this. I want to play this piece with Art. And so that was kind of the first piece that I arranged, and then arranged a whole record around it. Just kind of took my grief and sadness and anger and put it into my art rather than, a Facebook post or something.
For sure. Let's see. I think we have time to maybe cover like two more names.
Sure.
Nick Mancini.
I miss Nick. Nick moved to Tulsa through the pandemic. Nick is an incredible musician with a crazy ear. And it's so much fun to play with Nick because as a vibraphonist, he's also a percussionist. And so there's a lot of sticking figures that he'll play in his phrasing that I understand as a percussionist and can hear and can play along with, or can play against in a complementary way. He's so much fun to play with that way. Nick is very no nonsense. which is refreshing. You know, sometimes in LA, there's a bit of a softness or a bit of, people don't always tell you exactly how they feel. And man, if Nick was unhappy at a gig, you knew. He'd be like, are you feeling okay? Is everything all right? Like, okay, I'll pay attention. I'm sorry. We miss him here in LA and at CSUN. He was just such a firecracker in the scene.
Totally amazing player. And the last person I'm going to ask you about, I've never actually seen the two of you play together, but I understand that you've played some with Jeff Parker, the guitarist.
Yeah. Jeff is from Chicago, and me being from Detroit. One of the first records I was given as a teenager was from a fellow guitarist who was into Jeff. So he handed me Light Coping, his record, when I was 16. So I was listening to Jeff as a teenager. And in Cincinnati, I went to school with a drummer, Jeremy Cunningham, who then moved up to Chicago and started playing with Jeff a bit. And so then when Jeff moved out here, I think Jeremy was the one who told Jeff, you know, you should play with Tina, you should meet Tina. And somehow we got together and played a bit, started playing at ETA. Jeff is one of the people I've gone over and hung out with in this crazy experience, and had a jam session with him and Paul Bryan, and we're all looking at each other like, what? Music is hard, you know, trying to remember how this all worked. And of course we're being hard on ourselves, but, you know, just he has such an interesting approach to the instrument, a very dry sound, sounds very much like himself always. He's really a fun musician to play with, and his writing is really cool. If you haven't checked out Light Coping, check that record out. It's very cool.
Excellent. I think that's such a great description, that he always sounds like himself. That's so well put. Well, I'm pretty much out of questions here, but Tina, Raymond, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and learn more about your art.
You were going to ask me about restaurants in the Valley.
Okay, I was like on the fence if I should do that. Okay, I will though. Yeah, so you live in the San Fernando Valley, which to LA people, a lot of us know that there are, just a ton of incredible restaurants scattered all over the place. So do you have any that you would like to shout out?
Yes, Olive and Thyme in Burbank. I love that place. I bought the cookbook that was written by the chef and owner, and that place is awesome. Turns out almost everything I love there is made with mayonnaise. So there you go. In a little bit more west, Pancho's Taqueria has the most killing tacos. And Osteria La Buca just opened down in Sherman Oaks. That's a great Italian spot. Hank's Bagels, they've got locations in Sherman Oaks and Burbank. They're so good. So there you go.
Boom. So to all the LA area listeners, you got some good recommendations, to some homework to follow up on there. Okay, and with that, I think we'll wind it down. But Tina, Raymond, it's been amazing learning more about your perspective and your art. Thank you so much for making yourself available and sharing your time.
Thanks, Adam. It was a pleasure.